I went camping alone that weekend because I needed quiet. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I wanted a place where I could hear nothing but wind and insects. I picked a bit of bushland about 2 hours from town, a stretch of forest I'd been to before. It wasn't a proper campground, just open bush with a rough dirt track leading in, but it was far enough from roads that I wouldn't hear cars or people. It was the kind of place where the ground is soft with leaf litter, and every step crunches or cracks a stick. You can hear anything that moves out there. That was part of the reason I liked it. When I got there, the sun was starting to dip, that golden time of day where everything looks still. I found a small clearing surrounded by thin trees and dry undergrowth, set back from a faint animal trail. I could still see patches of the sky between the branches. The air smelled like dust and eucalyptus. I parked the car off to the side of the track, maybe 20 meters away, and walked the spot a few times to check for ants and rocks before pitching my tent. The ground was dry but soft enough for stakes. I set up a little fire ring with stones and gathered some fallen branches, enough to cook a bit and sit by the fire later. Once the tent was up and my sleeping bag unrolled, I made dinner, just canned beans and sausages over the small fire. It was quiet except for the distant sounds of kookaburras and the occasional rustle from something small moving through the leaves. Every now and then, I'd hear sticks snap somewhere out in the dark, probably wallabies or possums. You get used to that sound out bush, little things moving, scraping, digging. After I ate, I put out the fire properly and cleaned up all my stuff, making sure no food smell lingered. I sat outside the tent for a while, just listening. It felt completely still, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. There was no wind that night. The air felt heavy. The moon wasn't full, but bright enough that I could see the outlines of trees and the faint silver reflection of my car through the branches. When I finally crawled into the tent, I checked around once with my flashlight the way I always do. Just dry ground, leaves, a few moths tapping against the tent fabric. I zipped the flap closed, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and lay there for a while, listening to the soft creaks of the bush settling. Somewhere past midnight, I woke up. I couldn't tell what time exactly, but the light outside had that deep, almost metallic darkness you only see around 2 or 3 in the morning. At first, I thought I'd just woken up naturally. Then I realized what had woken me. A sound. It wasn't a rustle or snapping twig, not like something walking around. It was a single, dull plop. It didn't sound close, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the tent. I lay there completely still, waiting for another one, or for something to move, but there was nothing. Just that faint ringing silence that fills your ears when the world around you is too quiet. I remember thinking maybe something had fallen from a tree, a fruit, a branch, or even a possum landing somewhere. But usually you'd hear it moving afterward. You always do. Out there, every little animal makes noise when it runs. But this time, after that single plop, there was nothing. Not even leaves shifting. I waited maybe 10 minutes before I finally relaxed again. I could feel my heartbeat slowing back down. I told myself it was nothing important, just something natural, and drifted off again. When I woke up, the sun was already up. The light coming through the tent fabric was that soft orange you get in early morning. I lay there for a bit, half awake, thinking about making coffee and packing up slowly. Then I unzipped the tent flap. The first thing I saw made my stomach twist. Right there on the ground, barely a foot from the tent door, was the head of a kangaroo. It was lying on its side, fur matted and stiff. The eyes were half closed, dried out, and the mouth was slightly open, showing its yellowed teeth. The cut at the neck wasn't clean. It looked torn, uneven. There was dried blood around it, dark brown in the morning light. I froze. My brain just couldn't process it for a second. I hadn't seen or heard anything during the night, just that one sound. I looked around the clearing, scanning every direction, trying to see if there were footprints or drag marks or blood trails, but there was nothing. The leaf litter all around was undisturbed, like no one had walked there at all. The kangaroo's head looked freshly placed, not like it had been there long. It definitely hadn't been there when I set up camp. I cleared that exact patch when I staked the tent. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. Kangaroos don't just lose their heads. A predator might kill one, but you'd see a mess, for scattered blood trails, maybe even the body nearby. This looked deliberate. The head was placed perfectly, facing the tent, like someone had set it there on purpose. I started feeling that deep, crawling panic that begins low in your chest and spreads outward. My hands were shaking. The bush was still dead silent, like everything had left. Even the birds weren't calling. I didn't think, I just started packing. I threw everything into the car as fast as I could. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. I yanked the stakes out, shoved it all into the trunk. My stomach kept tightening every time I looked back toward where the head was lying. The idea that someone, or something, had walked right up to my tent while I was sleeping made my skin crawl. I should have heard them. The ground there was full of dry sticks. You couldn't take 2 steps without making noise. The drive out was rough because the track was narrow and bumpy, but I didn't care. I just wanted distance. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over for a second to catch my breath. My mouth was dry, my hands sore from gripping the wheel. The whole way home, I kept replaying the night in my head. That single plop, the silence afterward. It lined up too perfectly. Whatever that sound was, it wasn't something falling. It must have been when that head hit the ground. The part that stayed with me most wasn't even the sight of it. It was realizing how close whoever or whatever did that must have been. Just a few feet from where I slept, in total silence. I've camped alone more times than I can count, and I've never heard a person move that quietly on that kind of ground. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? There wasn't a body, no sign of struggle, no footprints. Just a severed kangaroo head next to a tent in the middle of nowhere. It would sound like some sick prank or something I made up. That night, when I finally got home, I washed my gear in the yard. There were still bits of dried leaves and dirt stuck to the tent fabric. I kept catching myself glancing at it, half expecting to see something again. The image wouldn't leave my mind. The way the head had been placed, the stillness of it, how there was no sound leading up to it. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still love the bush, the quiet, the space, but that moment changed something for me. It made me realize how fragile that sense of safety is when you're completely alone. How easily someone could walk right up in the dark and you'd never know until it was too late. Every now and then, when I'm driving past a patch of bushland or hearing crickets through an open window, I think about that plop. Just that one single sound in the night that meant someone was right there, watching me sleep, leaving something behind without a word. And I'll never understand why. It was late autumn when I decided to go camping alone again. The days were getting shorter, the air had that cold bite to it, and the leaves on the trees were mostly gone. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of brown and gold, and when you stepped on them, the sound carried in every direction. It was quiet, but not empty. You could hear the small life underneath it all, mice, insects, maybe a distant bird, but overall it felt dead still. That stillness was part of why I went out there. I needed a break from everything. I'd picked a spot about 4 miles off a service road, somewhere I had camped once years before. There was a clearing beside a small creek, enough space for a tent, a small fire pit, and a place to sit. You couldn't see the road from there, and you wouldn't hear anyone even if they were nearby. It was a lonely spot, but I liked it that way. When I arrived, the sky was overcast. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine. I unpacked my gear slowly, setting up the tent and collecting wood before the light faded. It was one of those days where everything felt heavy, the kind of cold that sticks in your clothes no matter how much you move. The forest was quiet, not even the usual sound of wind in the branches. As the sun disappeared, I built a fire and sat there for a while, watching the flames flicker against the trees. There's something about a campfire that keeps you grounded. Its movement, its warmth, how it becomes the only thing that feels alive around you. I cooked some food, listened to the water running faintly from the creek, and tried to clear my head. It was around 10 p.m. when I noticed it. The sound came from far off at first, faint but distinct, a kind of rhythmic crunch like someone walking. Out there, sounds carry far, especially at night. You get used to hearing animals, but this was different. It was steady, heavy, and slow, the sound of boots on dry leaves. At first, I assumed it was a deer or maybe someone hiking late, though it was odd for anyone to be that deep in the woods after dark. I kept my flashlight close just in case. The sound faded after a minute, and I convinced myself it was nothing. The fire burned lower, crackling softly. I added another log, the orange light reflecting off the metal of my pan beside me. The temperature was dropping fast, and the stars were hidden behind thick clouds. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time. It was coming from the same direction, just beyond the trees at the edge of my light. A slow, deliberate movement through the leaves, then silence. I strained to listen, my breath misting in front of me. I could feel the hairs on my arms lift. Something about the rhythm of the steps wasn't random, it was too human. The sound stopped again. I waited, flashlight ready, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of the fire. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably an animal curious about the firelight. That happens more often than people think. I tried to shake it off and focus on the warmth, but I couldn't stop glancing into the black space beyond the trees. Maybe 20 minutes passed before the next sound came. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a faint, low scraping noise, like something being dragged slowly across the ground. It came from somewhere off to my left, mixed with the rustle of leaves being pushed aside. My stomach tightened. I turned off my flashlight to let my eyes adjust to the dark. The sound continued for another few seconds, then stopped. The forest went completely still. I could hear my heartbeat and the faint hiss of the fire. I waited, but there was nothing else. No movement, no breath, no sign of anything alive. I told myself again it was probably just an animal moving something through the brush. I'd seen foxes drag carrion before. It wasn't unusual. Eventually, the fire burned down to a bed of glowing embers. The air was so cold by then that the smoke hung low, drifting in thin gray lines. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, the faint light of the fire still visible through the fabric. It took a while before I started to fall asleep. At some point deep into the night, I woke up suddenly. It was dead quiet. No wind, no insects, no crackle of firewood, just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until it starts to feel wrong. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sharp, acrid smell of burning hair and something else, something sickly sweet underneath it. My mind went blank for a second. I thought maybe something had fallen into the fire, a small animal or a piece of my gear, but I hadn't left anything near it. I sat up slowly, listening. The smell grew stronger. I could see the flicker of the firelight through the tent wall, brighter than it had been before. That made no sense. I hadn't added wood in hours. I unzipped the flap halfway and peered out. The sight hit me hard. Someone was standing there near the fire. It took my brain a moment to make sense of it. The figure was half lit by the flames, bent forward, arms hanging limp at their sides. Their clothes were dark, and the fire was roaring higher now, sending sparks upward. For a few seconds, I thought they were just standing too close, warming themselves, but then I saw the flames licking up their legs. They weren't standing near the fire. They were in it. Their body didn't move much, only a faint sway. The firelight threw harsh shadows across their face, and I could see skin blistering, clothes melting. The sound was a soft, wet crackle mixed with the popping of burning wood. The smell grew stronger until I had to cover my mouth. I couldn't move. I just watched, frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. The person, whoever they were, made no sound. No screaming, no movement to escape. They just stood there, burning. The flames rose higher, consuming the figure until it collapsed forward, half in the pit, half against the dirt. The fire hissed and spat, swallowing the shape until it was only a black mass. It felt like forever before the fire settled down again. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept waiting for something else. Footsteps, voices, anything. But there was nothing. Just the sound of the fire dying slowly and the faint crackle of ash. When the sun finally came up, the world looked washed out and gray. The forest was quiet again, calm, as if nothing had happened. I stepped out cautiously, my body stiff from sitting up all night. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable. The fire pit was full of blackened wood and white ash. In the center was a shape small and dark. The ground around it was scorched, and the air above still shimmered faintly with heat. It was what was left of the person from the night before. The clothes were mostly gone, burned away. I could see bones among the ash, pieces of what had once been hands or ribs. The dirt around the pit was dug up, scattered with shoe prints, fresh ones that weren't mine. They led from the tree line straight to the fire and stopped there. There were no prints leading away. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even pack up my camp properly. I just left. I hiked the entire way back to the car without looking behind me once. When I reached the ranger station near the road, I reported what I saw. They didn't seem to know what to make of it until they went out there themselves later that day. They found what I described, charred remains of a person. No signs of struggle, no indication of anyone else nearby. They said it looked like self-immolation, a suicide. The details came out later. The person had gone missing from a nearby town about a week before. They'd left their car abandoned near the trailhead and apparently wandered into the forest on foot. There was no note, nothing left behind to explain why. It's been years since then, but that night still replays in my head. The smell, the sound, the way the firelight moved against the trees. I've camped dozens of times since, but I've never stayed up that late by the fire again. Every time the flames start to die low and the forest grows silent, I can't help but picture that figure standing there, alone, still, and swallowed by the fire. Back in high school, my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, far away from any campsites or trails. We were all around 17, old enough to think we knew what we were doing, but young enough to still act reckless about it. The idea was simple. Hike as far out as we could into the forested mountains, set up camp, and spend the night completely off-grid. We wanted that sense of isolation, that raw quiet where you don't hear cars or people, just nature. We left early in the morning, carrying heavy backpacks with tents, sleeping bags, food, and just enough gear to last 2 nights. The trail we took started off easy. Dirt paths, sunlight through the trees, birds calling overhead, but the further we went, the more rugged it got. The ground grew uneven, full of rocks and roots, and the forest grew thicker. The air turned cooler as we gained elevation. By late afternoon, after hours of hiking, our shoulders ached and our legs felt like lead. We finally found a flat area between a few tall trees, a spot big enough for our 3 small tents and a fire ring. There was no one around for miles. You could just tell. The air had that untouched stillness, the kind that makes your own breathing sound too loud. We set up camp while there was still light. The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the treetops gold for a moment before everything turned dim and shadowy. The sounds changed too. Birds went quiet, replaced by faint creaks, soft rustles, and the far-off calls of something moving through the bush. We cooked some food, laughed about how sore we were, and stayed up talking for a while until the fire burned low. By the time I crawled into my tent, it was close to midnight. My body felt heavy, the kind of exhaustion that comes from hiking all day with too much weight. I remember lying there on my sleeping bag, feeling the ground press against my shoulders and back. The forest was pitch black beyond the thin tent walls, and the air was cold enough that I could see my breath in the dim glow of my flashlight before I turned it off. It was quiet for a while, just the occasional pop from the leftover embers of the fire and the soft sigh of wind moving through branches. I started to drift off, my mind fading between half awake and asleep, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a light step or shuffle through the leaves. I figured it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a possum. But then I heard another sound, this time on the other side of the tent. Then another. It was like something or several somethings were circling around the tent, one slow step at a time. The leaf litter outside made it easy to hear movement. Every footstep was clear. The crunch of dry leaves, the faint snap of a stick, then silence again. My heart started beating faster. It didn't sound like one animal. It sounded like several, moving carefully, almost deliberately, around us. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to listen. I could hear faint breathing, maybe from my friends in their tents, but no one moved. The steps came again, closer this time. The sound of leaves shifting just feet from my head. Then another movement to the left. Then behind me, felt like we were surrounded. The thing that made it worse was how steady it all was. Not random rustles or scampering. These were slow, heavy steps that paused, shifted direction, then started again. My brain kept trying to picture what it could be. I thought maybe wild dogs, maybe even people. But we hadn't seen anyone all day. We were too deep in. The forest outside was black as ink, and I knew the thin tent fabric wouldn't protect me from anything if it wanted to come through. I could feel the cold creeping up through the ground beneath me, my hands sweating even though the air was freezing. I reached slowly for my flashlight. I waited a few seconds, trying to time it with the next sound. Another crunch came from the back of the tent, close enough that I could almost sense the weight of whatever was standing there. My fingers shook as I clicked the flashlight on. The beam of light cut through the thin tent wall for a second. Then I unzipped the flap as quietly as I could and poked my head out, sweeping the light into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just trees, bushes, and thick shadows. Then I caught something that made my chest tighten. Pairs of eyes. They reflected the light perfectly, glowing pale green-white in the beam. Not small, low-to-the-ground eyes like you'd expect from foxes or raccoons. These were higher, maybe chest height on a person, and larger, spaced farther apart. As I moved the light, more of them appeared, one pair, then another, then another. There had to be at least 6 or 7 of them, all staring straight back. The forest was completely silent except for the sound of my breathing. I couldn't tell what they were. For a few seconds, my mind went blank. The idea that there were tall figures standing around us in the dark made my whole body tense. I felt that kind of fear that doesn't make you scream, it just locks you up completely. Then, as I watched, one of them moved slightly. Not toward me, but a slow, turning step, the faintest shift of a body in the beam. I saw a shape behind the eyes, narrow, slender, long neck, ears, and suddenly I realized what they were. Deer. A whole herd of them, frozen in place, staring straight at the light. Their bodies blended perfectly into the dark until the flashlight caught the edges of their shapes. The eyes had seemed high because they were standing on a small rise in the ground. I could see the outline of antlers on one of them, big and sharp-looking in the faint reflection. The rush of relief came so fast I almost laughed, but my body was still too wound up to move. They didn't make a sound, didn't run or stomp, just stood there, motionless, watching. After a while, the closest one flicked its ear, then turned away. The others followed, slipping silently into the trees until all the eyes vanished one by one. The forest went quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. I sat there for a few minutes, flashlight still in hand, my chest slowly settling. My friends hadn't moved in their tents, though I'm sure they'd heard something. I stayed awake for a while, listening, until eventually the exhaustion caught up again and I dozed off. When morning came, the sun filtered through the trees, and everything looked normal again. Dew on the grass, the fire pit cold and gray, birds calling somewhere far off. I stepped outside and looked around where I'd seen the eyes. The ground was covered in hoof prints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the soft dirt, leading off toward the tree line. It made sense after I thought about it. We'd camped near a clearing, probably right along a trail they used to move between feeding spots. They must have come through in the night and found us blocking their way. Deer can move incredibly quietly when they want to, and at night, their eyes reflect light like mirrors. Still, something about it stuck with me. The image of all those eyes in the dark, completely still, surrounding the tent without a sound. It was one of those moments that reminds you how small and out of place you really are in the wild. That night out there changed how I thought about camping. It wasn't dangerous, nothing bad happened, but the feeling of waking up to that silence and seeing those eyes staring back, it stayed in the back of my mind. Even now, when I go camping, I still wake up sometimes at night, listening to the sounds outside the tent, wondering what might be standing out there just beyond the light, watching quietly from the dark. It was around 2 in the morning when it happened. We were out camping deep in the woods, far enough from any road that you couldn't hear a single sound of civilization. Just the forest, the insects, and the low crackle of our dying campfire. The air was cold that night, the kind of chill that sticks to your skin even when you're sitting close to the flames. The sky above was completely black, covered by thick branches and leaves, and the only light we had came from the small fire and our flashlights resting beside our chairs. We'd been out there all day, hiking and exploring, and by the time night came, everyone was tired. We sat around the fire for hours, watching the flames burn lower and lower as we talked quietly and poked at the embers with sticks. It was peaceful in that strange, eerie way only deep woods can be. Everything around completely still, not even a hint of wind. You could hear the tiniest things. The soft pop of sap in the fire, the distant clicking of beetles in the brush, the occasional drip of water falling from a leaf somewhere in the dark. The fire had burned down to a low orange glow by then, just enough to light the ground immediately around us. Shadows moved across the dirt every time a log shifted. I remember staring into the coals, watching them pulse and breathe, when the sound started. At first it was faint, just a light rustling somewhere behind us. A few leaves brushing together, maybe a twig snapping. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that we all noticed it right away. You learn to pay attention to sounds when you're in the middle of nowhere like that. We all froze for a second, heads turning in the same direction. Then the rustling stopped. For a few moments, the only sound again was the soft, steady hiss of the fire. I remember looking out into the dark beyond the circle of light, where the forest just turned into blackness. I couldn't see anything, just the outlines of trees, like tall shadows standing motionless in every direction. Then the noise came again, louder this time, closer. It sounded like something small pushing through dry leaves, fast but unsteady. We all reached for our flashlights at the same time. The beams of light swept across the woods, bouncing off trunks, catching bits of dust and smoke in the air. I scanned the ground, my stomach tightening, expecting to see something crouched or running. The sound grew sharper, a fast, desperate scuffle through the undergrowth. Then, out of nowhere, something small burst out from the dark and into the edge of the firelight. At first, it didn't even look like an animal, just a blur of grayish-brown movement. But when it came fully into the light, I could see what it was, a mole. Its body was tiny, about the size of my hand, fur matted and dark. It moved in this frantic, jerky way, almost tumbling forward like it couldn't control itself. Before any of us could react, it kept running straight toward the center of the camp. It didn't slow down. It didn't turn. It just ran right into the fire. The sound that followed is something I'll never forget. A sharp, horrible sizzling hiss that cut through the night, followed by the smell of burning fur and flesh. The mole's tiny body twisted for a second in the flames, then went still. The noise of it sizzling, that faint popping sound, was so distinct that I can still hear it if I think about it long enough. The smell hit next, sharp and sour, like burnt hair mixed with something foul. It made my stomach turn. For a few seconds, no one moved. We just stared, frozen in shock. The fire crackling louder now as if it had been fed fresh fuel. The sound of it eating away at that small body filled the silence around us. My hands were shaking, and my flashlight beam trembled across the dirt. It didn't feel real, like something out of a nightmare. Something so small and harmless running full speed into its own death right in front of us. The whole forest felt dead quiet after that. No insects, no wind, not even the usual rustles from the underbrush. Just the low hiss of the fire and the smell of burnt fur hanging thick in the air. I remember sitting back, my heart pounding, feeling the cold return against my face even though the fire was right there. None of us said a word. It didn't feel like something we should talk about. It just happened, and it left this heavy, tense feeling hanging over us. Every little sound after that made me flinch. The snap of a burning twig, the shifting of someone's shoe on the dirt. Eventually, the fire settled again. The glow dimmed, the flames sank, and what was left of the mole turned into a small, blackened lump in the ashes. The night stretched on endlessly after that. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little body darting from the dark, running straight into the fire like it was blind or being chased by something we couldn't see. When morning finally came, the sunlight made the whole scene look almost normal again. The forest looked harmless in the daylight. Just quiet trees, the smell of dew, and our campfire burned down to gray ash. But the sight of what was left in the center of the fire pit made my stomach twist again. The mole's body was still there, or what was left of it. Charred black, small bones curled inward. The skull cracked slightly from the heat. The fur that hadn't burned completely had melted into a dark patch against the ash. It didn't look like an animal anymore, just a lump of something that shouldn't have been there. None of us wanted to leave it like that. It didn't feel right, so we decided to bury it. We found a small patch of soft dirt a little away from the camp, under a tree that caught the morning light. Using the edges of our metal plates and a flat rock, we dug a shallow hole. The ground was damp and cold, and the smell of earth mixed with the faint smoke still clinging to our clothes. One of us picked up the remains with a stick and carried it over, still smoking faintly, and lowered it into the hole. We covered it gently, pressing the dirt down with our boots. I remember feeling strange about it. Not exactly sad, but uneasy. The whole thing seemed too deliberate, too final, like we were giving a proper funeral to something we didn't understand. We marked the spot with a small flat stone and a few twigs crossed over it. It wasn't much, but it felt like the least we could do after watching it die like that. Afterward, we packed up camp quietly. Nobody really said much the rest of the morning. The air was cool, the birds were back to chirping, and everything looked peaceful again, but it didn't feel peaceful. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. I kept thinking about that moment when it had come running out of the darkness, as if it had no idea where it was going, or maybe it did and something had driven it there. The smell of burnt fur stayed faintly in my clothes even after I washed them when I got home. It clung to the fabric, that bitter reminder of the night. It's been years since then, but that image still sticks in my head sometimes, especially when I'm sitting by a campfire at night. The sound of a small animal moving in the dark still makes me tense up without thinking. I've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was sick, maybe it was disoriented, maybe it was running from a predator we couldn't see. But none of them feel right. What unsettles me most isn't the mole itself or even what it did, but how fast it happened. One moment it was the quiet, peaceful kind of night that makes you feel safe, and the next, it was something completely different. Sudden, violent, and silent again as if nothing had happened. That's the thing about being out in the woods at night. You think you understand what's around you because it's quiet and still, but you never really do. There's always something out there moving, hidden, just outside the reach of the light. And sometimes, for reasons you'll never understand, it runs straight toward you. I went camping alone last summer, something I'd been meaning to do for a long time. I had gone camping plenty of times with friends before, but this time I wanted to be by myself. I wanted quiet, no phone, no people, just me and the woods. I chose a small, out-of-the-way campground near a lake in northern Michigan. It wasn't one of those busy public campgrounds. It was tucked off a dirt road, maybe 20 minutes away from the nearest paved road. I found it on a local outdoor forum where people shared secret camping spots. I got there in the late afternoon. The air was heavy and still, and there wasn't another soul around. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier, and the forest smelled damp. I picked a flat spot near the edge of the lake, about 30 yards from the tree line. The lake was perfectly still, like a mirror, reflecting the thick pine trees that surrounded it. The silence felt good at first. I could hear small sounds, the faint tapping of water against the shore, the occasional buzz of a mosquito near my ear, and the soft creak of my tent poles as I set them up. After I pitched the tent, I gathered wood from around the area. Most of it was damp, but I found enough dry sticks under some pine needles to get a small fire going. I cooked a can of chili on the fire and ate slowly while watching the sun drop behind the trees. When it started getting dark, I realized just how isolated I was. No cars, no voices, no lights, just that low hum of insects and the occasional splash from the lake. By the time night came, the forest around me had turned into a wall of black. My fire flickered and popped, casting quick flashes of light against the trees. I tried to read a little by flashlight, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd hear something, a snapping twig, a rustle in the leaves, and I'd freeze, waiting. It was probably small animals, I kept telling myself. Rabbits, raccoons, maybe deer. But when you're alone like that, your brain starts to twist sounds into things that feel bigger. Around midnight, I decided to put out the fire and go to sleep. I zipped myself into my tent and lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the small sounds outside. It took a while to drift off, but eventually I must have fallen asleep. I woke up sometime later to a noise that didn't fit with the usual forest sounds. It wasn't an animal scurrying through leaves. It was steady, crunching steps, slow, deliberate, the kind of steps made by something heavy. My first thought was that it was a deer wandering near my camp, but these steps weren't the quick, light ones deer make. They were slower and they stopped every few seconds, like whoever or whatever it was pausing to listen. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, holding my breath. My tent was zipped up tight, but I could see faint shapes through the thin fabric, the shadows from the moonlight above. I listened. The steps came closer, then stopped, then again closer still. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Stopped again, maybe 10 feet from my tent. Then nothing. No more steps. Just the wind barely moving the trees. I didn't dare move. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but I didn't. I just stayed still, waiting, trying to convince myself it was just some animal. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the sound fade away. Slow crunching steps moving back toward the trees. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening to every noise, trying to keep myself calm. Eventually, I must have dozed off again because I woke up to daylight spilling into the tent. When I stepped outside, everything looked normal. My campsite was just as I left it. I checked around the tent and noticed something that made my stomach twist. About 20 feet from where I had been sleeping, in the soft mud near the lake, were footprints. Not boot prints, barefoot. They were clear and deep, and large enough to tell they didn't belong to a kid. I stood there for a long time staring at them. They came from the direction of the woods and stopped near my tent, then turned back the same way. That changed everything. I wasn't alone out there. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night, barefoot, and stood near my tent for a while. I felt a cold, crawling feeling move through me. I started packing up right away, throwing everything into the back of my car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to be gone. As I was finishing, I noticed something else. Across the lake, on the other side, the trees were thick, but there was a small clearing where I could see a faint shape. It looked like a small structure, maybe a shack or an old cabin half hidden by branches. I hadn't noticed it before. It was on the far side, probably a 15-minute walk if you went around the lake. I stared at it for a while, feeling this mix of curiosity and unease. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to understand what I had heard last night. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a quick look. I told myself I'd just go halfway around the lake and see it from a distance. I grabbed a small pocket knife, just in case, and started walking along the shore. The closer I got, the quieter the woods felt. Even the birds had gone silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. When I finally got close enough, I saw the place clearly. An old wooden shack, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with a collapsed roof and one side caved in. The door was half hanging off its hinges. It didn't look lived in, but something about it felt off. I walked closer, slowly, my boots sinking into the damp ground. When I reached the front, I saw an old metal chair sitting by the door. On the seat of the chair was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, maybe small and brittle looking. There were also scraps of cloth tangled in the weeds nearby, and a few empty food cans scattered around. But what made my stomach twist was a thin rope tied to a tree beside the shack, the end frayed and hanging loose. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I backed away, my heart pounding hard, and started walking fast back toward my camp. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had walked through my campsite came from that shack. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe someone hiding out. I didn't want to know. When I got back, I tossed the last of my stuff into the car and drove off without even looking back. The dirt road felt endless, and I didn't start to relax until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked at a small gas station, where I finally took a deep breath. That night, in a motel room, I couldn't stop thinking about those barefoot prints. The way they came right up to my tent and stopped. Whoever it was stood there for a long time watching me sleep. That thought has stuck with me ever since. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone for a while. But sometimes, late at night, I think about how quiet it was out there, how far I was from everything, and how easy it would have been for someone to watch me without me ever knowing. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still love the outdoors, but I can't shake what happened that night. Every time I think about sleeping out in the woods again, I see those prints in the mud, perfectly clear, deep in the soft earth, stopping just a few feet from where I slept. I was 9 years old the first time I ever went camping up on Mount Lemmon, just outside Tucson, Arizona. Back then, I didn't know much about the history of the place, just that there used to be some kind of old prison camp up there that had been shut down a long time ago. The adults said it was a historic site, and some parts of it had been turned into camping grounds. Most of the original camp was gone. Only broken concrete slabs, cracked foundations, and rusted metal pieces sticking out of the ground here and there. It looked like the remains of some forgotten construction project more than anything else. To me, at that age, it was just a cool and slightly creepy place to camp. I didn't think about who used to be there or what the place was really for. I just thought old prison meant it was where criminals were once locked up, and that was that. We went in early spring, when the air on the mountain was cold at night but not freezing. The sky was clear, and you could see every star once the sun dropped behind the ridges. My family had picked a spot near what used to be a foundation, for broken walls made of crumbling concrete that barely rose up past my knees. There was still some old fencing half buried in the dirt and a few rusted pipes that stuck up from the ground, but we didn't think much of it. We set up 2 tents, one for my parents and one for me. I remember being proud that I had my own tent that trip. I felt older than I was. I even built my own small fire ring from stones I found near the site and roasted my own marshmallows before bed. When night came, it got dark faster than I expected. The woods around Mount Lemmon were dense, and the cold air rolled down from the higher elevations, making it feel quiet and heavy. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional snapping of wood as it cooled. My parents were in their tent talking softly before going to sleep, and I was in mine, zipped up in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows the firelight made on the tent walls. I must have fallen asleep for a while, but I woke up in the middle of the night needing to pee. It was that kind of urgent, full bladder feeling that wouldn't let me go back to sleep. I tried to hold it for a bit, but it got worse. I unzipped my sleeping bag carefully, trying not to make too much noise, and then opened the tent flap. The air outside was colder than I expected. It hit my face and made me shiver. The fire had died down to just glowing embers, but there was still enough light to see around the camp. The forest around us looked black, like it swallowed everything beyond the reach of the coals. I grabbed the small flashlight my dad gave me and started walking toward a cluster of trees about 20 or 30 feet away. The ground was uneven, full of stones and small roots that poked through the dirt. I could see the outline of the old concrete foundation behind me, the edges jagged and half-buried. When I reached the trees, I turned off the flashlight to save the battery and because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of my hands and the pale trunks of trees around me. I started peeing, trying to finish fast so I could get back to the warmth of my tent. That's when I heard it. At first, it sounded like wind moving through the trees, but there wasn't any wind that night. Then it came again, soft, broken crying. Not loud, just quiet enough that it sounded far away, but close enough that it didn't seem like an animal. It was definitely a person. The sound was shaky, like someone trying not to make noise but failing. I froze. The sound came again, crying, muffled but distinct. I turned my head toward where I thought it was coming from. It wasn't deep in the forest, maybe just beyond the clearing where our tents were. And then, through the quiet, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried through the trees, but I understood one word perfectly. Tasakit. I didn't even think at first. My brain just went blank. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't know what to do, but I knew what that word meant. I was born in Japan, though I didn't remember living there since my dad got stationed in the US when I was 2. But I'd heard my parents use some common Japanese words when I was little, and that one stuck with me. It meant help me. I stopped peeing midstream without even realizing it. The fear hit me all at once. There was something about hearing that word, in that voice, out there in the middle of nowhere, that made every hair on my body stand up. I turned and ran straight back toward the tents, trying not to trip over rocks or tree roots. The air felt thick, and I could barely breathe. I reached my tent, zipped it shut, crawled back into my sleeping bag, and pulled it up over my head. I didn't move after that. I could still hear faint sounds outside, nothing clear, just soft rustling and maybe another faint cry. But I didn't look. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, trying not to make a sound. My heart didn't slow down until the faint light of morning started showing through the tent walls. When I finally got up, the campsite looked exactly the same as before. My parents were already making breakfast, and everything looked normal. But the woods felt different to me. They were quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like holding their breath. I didn't tell my parents about what I heard that morning. I don't know why. Maybe I thought they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I didn't want to admit how scared I'd been. I just stayed close to camp for the rest of the trip and tried to ignore the strange feeling that lingered. It wasn't until years later, when I was in high school, that I learned what the old camp actually was. I was reading an article online about historical sites near Tucson, and there it was, Catalina Federal Honor Camp, also known as the Mount Lemmon Prison Camp. It had been built during World War II and used to house Japanese-American prisoners and conscientious objectors who refused to fight. That word, tasakit, came back to me the moment I read that. I felt a cold chill run through my chest, even though it had been years since that night. I realized that when I was 9, I hadn't been camping on just any old prison ground. I'd been sleeping on what used to be a place where people were kept against their will, far from home, in a time when the world was falling apart. Some of them never left. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I never have. But the thought that maybe I heard someone out there that night, someone hurt, lost, or in distress, never really left me. I thought about all the trails and drop-offs on that mountain, how easy it would be for someone to get lost or hurt. Maybe it was just a hiker calling for help. Maybe it was someone camping farther up the ridge. But I'll never forget how that voice sounded, tired, desperate, like it came from deep inside the dark. I can still hear the way it broke when it said that one word. After that, I never went back to that part of Mount Lemmon. I've camped in plenty of places since then, but I always make sure I know what used to be there before I set up my tent. Some places hold history that doesn't fade away just because the walls have crumbled. And no matter how much time passes, every time I wake up in the middle of the night while camping, I still hesitate before stepping outside, because I can't shake the memory of standing in the cold, the forest silent all around me, and hearing someone out there in the dark whisper, "Help me." It started off like any other camping trip. My siblings and I had planned it for weeks, wanting to spend a weekend out by the lake before summer ended. We grew up fishing and swimming there, so it wasn't unfamiliar territory. The plan was simple: set up our tents by the water, cook some food, hang out around the fire, and crash under the stars. The weather forecast showed nothing more than some light rain, so we didn't think twice about going. Looking back, that small line about possible thunderstorms should have made us think twice. We arrived late in the afternoon, maybe around 5 p.m. The sun was low and the air was thick with humidity. The lake looked like glass, the reflection of the trees on the far side completely still. We parked near the campsite and started unloading our gear. The ground was soft, still damp from earlier rain, and every step we took made a dull squish. We picked a nice flat spot near the water, maybe 15 or 20 feet from the shoreline, where the tree line opened just enough to give us a clear view of the lake. Setting up the tent was routine. We'd done it enough times that we barely needed to talk to each other. One person held the poles, another stretched the corners, another hammered the stakes. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine sap. By the time we finished, the sky was turning that deep golden color that makes everything look calm and perfect. We got a small fire going, cooked some food, and sat around the flames until the mosquitoes started coming out. As night fell, I noticed the sky changing faster than it should. The horizon, which had been pink and orange a few minutes before, started turning gray. Then, the gray deepened into a kind of dark blue that didn't feel right. You could hear distant rumbles, faint at first, like a truck miles away. I didn't say anything, but I kept glancing over at the far side of the lake. There were flashes of light every few seconds. Not the quick streak of lightning, but a soft glow that seemed to stay for a few moments before fading. It looked like the entire sky was pulsing. By around 11 p.m., the wind started to pick up. You could hear it move through the trees like waves, soft at first and then stronger. The lake wasn't calm anymore. The surface rippled constantly, reflecting the flashes of lightning that were coming more often now. The temperature dropped fast. Felt like the air was charged with static. Every hair on my arm stood up, and I remember thinking how quiet everything else had gone. Even the crickets and frogs stopped. The storm came in fast, faster than any of us expected. It started with a gust that nearly flattened the fire. The flames flickered sideways, sending sparks toward the water. Then the first real bolt of lightning hit the lake. It wasn't just a flash. It was like a camera flash multiplied 100 times, white and blinding. The sound came half a second later, a deep, cracking boom that seemed to echo off the trees. After that, it didn't stop. Lightning hit the lake again and again, sometimes branching across the clouds, sometimes slamming into the ground in the distance. Each flash lit up the trees in ghostly blue light, and in between the flashes, everything went completely black. The thunder didn't sound like separate bursts anymore. It became one continuous roar that didn't seem to stop. The wind was the worst part. It started ripping through the trees so violently that you could hear branches snapping. The tent began to shake, the walls bending inward with each gust. It was hard to tell how close anything was because you couldn't see more than a few feet outside. The rain came next, thick, heavy drops that hit the tent like handfuls of gravel. Within seconds, the sound was deafening. The ground under us began to feel soft, and water started pooling near the edges of the tent. Every few seconds, the wind would lift one side off the ground just a little. At first, we tried to hold the corners down, but after one particularly strong gust almost pulled the stakes out completely, it became clear the tent wasn't going to survive the night. I remember my heart pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it over the storm. We made the decision to head to the car. The car was parked maybe 100 feet away through a thin patch of trees, but that short distance felt like miles in that storm. The rain stung against my face, and every flash of lightning made it impossible to see. The wind pushed so hard that I had to lean forward just to move. I could feel the mud sucking at my boots as I ran. When I reached the car and yanked the door open, the sound of the storm was suddenly muffled. The others climbed in right after, soaked and shivering. The rain was hammering the roof so loudly that it sounded like hail. The car rocked side to side with each burst of wind. I looked through the windshield and could barely make out our campsite through the rain. But in one flash of lightning, I saw the tent lift off the ground, twist in the air, and slam into a nearby tree. The poles bent instantly, and the fabric tore apart. We sat in the car, not talking, just watching the storm destroy everything we'd set up. The wind howled around us, and every time the lightning struck the lake, the whole world turned white for a second. I'd been through storms before, but nothing like that. There was a constant deep rumbling that you could feel more than hear. It made the air vibrate. I started to wonder if this was something worse than just a thunderstorm. The car started to shake harder, not just from the wind, but from something more intense. It felt like the pressure was changing around us, the air thinning. I gripped the steering wheel even though we weren't moving. My sister pointed toward the tree line, and in one of the lightning flashes, we saw a line of trees bending in one direction, almost flat. It wasn't random gusts anymore. It looked like a twisting force was pushing through the woods. That's when it hit me. It was a tornado. Without saying anything, I started the car and drove. The road out of the campsite was narrow, uneven, and muddy, and I could barely see through the windshield. Every branch that hit the car sounded like glass breaking. The wind pushed against us so hard that it felt like something was trying to stop us from leaving. I kept my hands locked on the wheel, trying to stay between the trees. My whole body was tense, and every time I blinked, I expected to see something. Trees falling, water rising, something. It took about 20 minutes to reach my grandpa's house. The storm was still going strong, but by the time we pulled into the driveway, it felt like we were finally away from whatever was happening back there. When I turned off the engine, the silence inside the car was heavy. My arms hurt from how hard I'd been gripping the steering wheel. We stayed the night there. None of us slept much. The sound of the wind outside never fully stopped, and every time the lightning flashed through the curtains, I felt my stomach tighten again. The next morning, when we drove back to the campsite, the scene didn't look real. Trees were down everywhere, blocking parts of the road. Branches and debris were scattered across the ground like someone had shaken the whole forest. When we reached the clearing where we had set up camp, the tent was still wrapped around the tree it had hit, shredded and half buried in mud. Everything else, our chairs, cooler, sleeping bags, was either missing or ruined. The park rangers had closed off part of the campground. They said a small tornado had passed through during the night, maybe half a mile wide, just enough to tear through the area we were in. From the pattern of fallen trees, it looked like it had passed frighteningly close to our site. We cleaned up what we could, stuffed the damaged gear into trash bags, and left. I kept looking around, trying to find my sleeping bag, but it was gone. Either blown into the lake or carried off somewhere into the woods. Driving away, I kept thinking about how it all happened so fast. 1 minute we were sitting by a calm lake under a perfect sky, and a few hours later, nature reminded us how small we really are. I've camped a lot since then, but I've never experienced a storm like that again. Every time the wind picks up at night now, I can't help but picture that tent lifting off the ground, spinning in the lightning flashes, and vanishing into the dark.